Good morning. Today we're going to read a short excerpt from Melba Patil-Beal's memoir called Warriors Don't Cry. It is about her experience with school integration back in 1957 in Little Rock, Arkansas. Before we do that, a quick little history lesson on the history prior to that event. Back in 1896, the Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal is okay, which was the basis for segregation in the South. For example, white-only bathrooms, white-only water fountains, and white-only schools. The problem was obviously that separate is never equal. Then in 1954 in Brown versus the Boards of Education, the Supreme Court ruled that separate is not equal and that segregation is not okay. And then many states integrated schools immediately following that ruling, where Arkansas did not. And Governor Faubus defied that federal court ruling, and integration was stalled until 1957, which is when Melba was part of the Little Rock Nine who integrated that school in Arkansas. And that's where our story picks up. As we approached Central High School, Mother and I could see clusters of white people stretch for a distance of 2 blocks along the entire span of school. Uniformed National Guard soldiers were carrying weapons, like in war movies. People were shouting and pointing. As we drew near, the angry outbursts became even more intense. 2, 4, 6, 8, we ain't gonna integrate. Over and over the words rang out. The terrifying frenzy of the crowd was building like steam in an erupting volcano. White men and women, with angry faces and wide-open mouths, were screaming their rage. Their words are becoming increasingly vile, fueled by what was happening directly in front of the school. We stretched tall to see. "Oh, my Lord," Mother said. The anger of that huge crowd was directed toward my friend Elizabeth Eckford, as she stood alone in front of Central High, facing a long line of soldiers with a huge crowd of white people screeching at her back. Barely 5 feet tall, Elizabeth desperately searched for the right place to enter the school. Each time she approached, the National Guard closed ranks, shutting her out. The guardsmen did nothing to protect Elizabeth from her stalkers. When a crowd of 50 or more closed like diving vultures, the soldiers stared dead ahead as if posing for a photograph. Under siege, Elizabeth slowly made her way to the bench at the bus stop. Looking straight ahead as she walked, she did not acknowledge the people yelping at her heels like mad dogs. Mother and I looked at each other, suddenly conscious that we were too trapped in a violent mob. Ever so slowly, we eased our way back through the crowd, trying not to attract attention. But a white man clawed at me, grabbing my sleeve. "We got us one right here," he yelled. Somehow I managed to scramble away. Mother took my arm. We moved fast, heading for our car. We made our way down the block, but when I looked back, I saw a man following us, yelling, "They're getting away!" Now we were chased by 4 men, and their number was growing. "Melba, take these keys," Mother commanded as she tossed them at me. "Get to the car. Leave without me if you have to." I plucked the keys from the air. "No, Mama, I won't go without you." I felt the sting of her hand as it struck the side of my face. She had never slapped me before. "Do what I say," she shouted. I couldn't leave her there. I reached back to take her arm and pull her forward. The men were gaining on us. If we were yelled for help or made any fuss, others might join our attackers. Running faster, I felt myself begin to wear out. I didn't have enough breath to keep moving so fast. My knees hurt. My calves were aching. The men chasing us were joined by another carrying a rope. At times, our pursuers were so close, I could look back and see the anger in their eyes. Mama's pace slowed, and one man grabbed for her arm. The fabric of her blouse ripped, and he fell backward. Mama stepped out of her high-heeled shoes, leaving them behind, her pace quickening in stocking feet. One of the men closest to me swung at me with a large tree branch, but missed. I felt even more panic rise up in my throat. If he hit me hard enough to knock me over, I would be at his mercy. As I turned the corner, our car came into sight. I ran hard, faster than ever, unlocked the door, and jumped in. My mother was barely able to keep ahead of her attackers. I could see them, close on her heels, moving fast toward us. I swung open the passenger door for Mother and revved the engine. Barely waiting for her to shut the door, I shoved the gear shift into reverse and backed down the street with more speed than I've ever driven forward. One of the men caught up and pounded his fist on the hood of the car. Another threw a brick at our windshield. Turning, we gained speed as we drove through the hail of shouts and stones and glaring faces, but I knew I would make it because the car was moving fast and Mama was with me. After that first attempt to enter Central High, Melba broke into tears. Her family feared for her safety, but they also felt that the push for integration was a God-given mission. "You'll make this your last cry," Melba's grandmother said. "You're a warrior on the battlefield for our Lord. God's warriors don't cry. We act with courage, and with God's help we ship trouble right on out." But it would take all the courage Melba's family could summon. Amid constant threatening phone calls, gunshots blasted their living room windows. Grandma sat up all night with a shotgun on her lap. On September 23rd, nearly 3 weeks later, the 9 students would try to enter Central High again. With the help of the NAACP, they won a federal court order banning the governor's use of the National Guard. Integration would proceed, but who would protect the 9 black teenagers? Melba's story continues. September 23rd, insult to injury. We pulled up to the side entrance of Central High School. The white hand of a uniformed police officer reached out toward the car, and his urgent voice ordered us to hurry. The roaring coming from the front of the building made me glance to my right. Only half a block away, hundreds of white people, their bodies in motion, mouths wide open, shouted their anger. I was frozen by what I saw and heard. Policemen stood in front of the wooden sawhorse, barricades holding the people back. The rumble of the crowd was like that at a football game, only this time none of the voices were cheering. The roar swelled, the frenzy fired up by something. It took a moment to digest the fact that it was the sight of us. Hustled along, we walked up the concrete stairs and through the heavy double doors. It was like entering a darkened movie theater. I was barely able to see. Images blurred all around me as we rushed up more stairs. The sounds of footsteps, ugly words, shouted insults, and whispered commands formed an echoing clamor. "They got in!" They were talking about me. The shouting got louder, and more joined in. "They're in here! Oh God, they're inside!" One white girl shouted, running down the hallway. "You better turn around and go home. I smell something." I was racing to keep pace with the woman who shouted orders over her shoulder to us. I struggled to move among the angry voices, to accustom my eyes to the dim light. The marble floors, stone wall, and long winding hallways seemed to go on forever. The building was cavernous, the largest I'd ever been in. Breathless, I made my legs carry me quickly, dodging fists that struck out at me. In the principal's office, a row of white people stood staring at us as if we were the world's 8th wonder. The vice principal gave us our class schedules. I was assigned to the 3rd floor. Quickly, the 9 of us compared notes. Each was assigned to a different homeroom. "Why can't any of us take classes together?" I asked. From behind the long desk, a man spoke in a booming voice. "You wanted integration? You got it." I turned to see the hallway swallow up my friends. I was alone in a daze, following my guide, a muscular, stocky white woman with closely cropped hair. Up the stairs I went, squeezing past those who blocked my path. They shouted hurtful words at me. Frightened did not describe my state. I had moved on to terrified. For years, I had fantasized about how wonderful it would be to get inside the beautiful castle I knew as Central High School. But the reality was so much darker and more treacherous than I had imagined. I could easily get lost, and the angry voices made it all the harder to find my way through these unfamiliar surroundings. I was panic-stricken. At the thought of losing sight of my guide, I ran to keep up. "Move it, girlie," she called. "P.U.," one boy said, backing from me. Others joined in his ridicule. I stood paralyzed. "Don't stop," the woman commanded. Her words snapped me into action. Suddenly, I felt the sting of a hand slapping the side of my cheek, then warm, slimy saliva on my face dropping to the collar of my blouse. A woman stood toe-to-toe with me, not moving. She shouted in my face, calling me ugly names. She appeared to be a little older than my mother. Her face was distorted by rage. "Why don't you go home?" she lashed out. "Next thing, you'll want to marry one of our children." Why would I choose to marry one of those mean Little Rock white people? My temples throbbed, my cheeks stung, the spit was still on my face. It was the first time I'd ever been spat upon. I felt hurt, embarrassed. I wondered if I'd catch the woman's germs. My guide's harsh command summoned me to move. "Get going! Do you hear me? Move! Now!" I brushed the saliva off my nose. As I entered my first classroom, a hush fell over the students. I walked toward an empty seat. Students sitting nearby quickly gathered their books and moved away. I sat down, feeling unbearably self-conscious. Still, I was relieved to be off my feet. I was disoriented, as though my world were blurred and leaning to the left. The teacher ignored me. "Are you going to let her sit in our class?" a boy shouted as he glared at me. I waited for the teacher to say or do something. "Now, class, if you've done your homework," a loud voice cut her off. "Look, it's 20 of us and one of her. We can kick her," the heckler continued. "They ain't nothing but animals." Again, I waited for the teacher to speak up, but she said nothing. The boy kept shouting ugly words at me through the rest of class. My heart was weeping, but I choked back the tears. I squared my shoulders and tried to remember what my grandma had said. "God loves you, child. No matter what, He sees you as His precious idea." Walking the gauntlet to my next class was even more harrowing. I had to go through the girls' dressing room, down a long concrete walkway, and onto the playing field. Outside, I could hear the deafening roar of the crowd in front of the school. On the field, groups of girls were tossing a volleyball. With a smile, the teacher pointed me to a spot near the net and warned the other girls not to bother me. "Let's keep the game going," she said in a matter-of-fact way. For just one instant, I actually wondered if I could hit the ball and score. It took me a moment to realize it was whizzing at my head. I ducked, but the girls hit me real hard, shouting and cheering as they found their target. Even as I struggled to escape their cruelty, I was more terrified by the sound of the angry crowd in the distance. It must be enormous, I thought. How would the police keep them back? "Get inside, Melba, now!" The face of the gym teacher showed both compassion and alarm as she pointed to the group of women jumping over the rear fence, shouting obscenities. "Hurry!" I started to run for my life. "Get her!" one woman cried, hot on my heels. 3 of them broke away from the pack and were gaining on me. I was running at top speed when someone stuck out their foot and tripped me. I fell face forward, cutting my knee and elbow. Several girls moved closer, and for an instant I hoped they were drawing near to extend a hand to ask me if I needed help. "She's down," one shouted. "She's bleeding." "What do you know?" "They bleed red blood. Let's kick her." I saw the foot coming and grabbed it before it got to my face. I twisted at the ankle, as I'd seen in wrestling matches. The girl fell backward. As I scrambled to my feet, I looked back to see the brigade of attacking mothers within striking distance, shouting that they weren't going to have me in school with their kids. I ran up the stairs, hoping I would find my way back to the office. With the mothers close on my heels, shouting threats to the twisted maze of halls seemed even more menacing. I felt I could have gotten lost forever. I raced through the honeycomb of locker rooms and dead-end hallways. After several minutes of opening the wrong doors and bumping into people who hit me or called me names, I was in tears, ready to give up, paralyzed by my fear. Suddenly, Grandma's voice came into my head. "God never loses one of His flock. Shepherd, show me how to go," I said. I stood still and repeated those words until I gained composure. I wiped my eyes, and then I saw blood running down my leg into my saddle shoe. It was too much. I pressed my thumb to the wound to try to stop the bleeding. "I've been looking for you." The stocky guide's voice was angry, but I was so glad to see her I almost hugged her. "And just where do you think you're going?" She looked at my leg but said nothing. "Let's go to shorthand class." She didn't know it, but she was the answer to my prayer. I looked over my shoulder to see the group of mothers standing still, obviously unwilling to come after me with the school official at my side. I choked back tears and speeded my steps. "Hello, honey, welcome. We're just beginning. I'm Mrs. Pickwick." Her warm voice comforted me. Although she was petite, I quickly discovered that my shorthand teacher was not one to tolerate hanky-panky. When students moved away from me, hurling insults, she gave them the stern reprimand. "If you move up to the principal's office," she said. As I headed for the last row of empty seats, she called out to me, "Melba, stay away from the window." Her voice was sympathetic, as though she really cared what happened to me. As I turned, I caught a glimpse of the crowd across the street from the front of the school. I was transfixed by the sight, an ocean of people stretching farther than I could see, waves of them ebbing and flowing, shoving sawhorses and the policemen who were trying to keep them in place. The crowd outnumbered the police 100-fold. "Melba, please take your seat." I stumbled to my seat and tried to focus on the book before me. The noise got louder and louder. I looked up from the notes on my tablet to see my guide entering the room. She wore a frown and was red-faced and perspiring. Something was awfully wrong. It was written all over her face. "Come with me now," she called out nervously. She collected my books and shoved them into my arms. I walked even faster than before, almost running. "Don't stop for anything," she shouted at me over the noise. I followed her through an interior office past official-looking white men with anxious expressions on their faces. I was led to a smaller office where some of the other 8 had gathered. 2 of the girls were crying. I stood near the door, which was ajar. Although I could not see who was speaking, I could hear the man's frantic tone of voice. The mob was out of control, they said. They would have to call for help. "What are we going to do about these children?" asked one. "The crowd is moving fast. They've broken the barricades. These kids are trapped in here." "Good Lord, you're right," another voice said. "We may have to let the mob have one of these kids, so we can distract them enough to get the others out." "Let one of these kids hang? How's that going to look? They're children, and we got a job to do." Hang one of us? They were talking about hanging one of my friends? Maybe even me? My knees were shaking so bad, I thought I would fall over. I held my breath, trying not to make any noise. The 2 men, discussing our fate, were just on the other side of the door. I turned my back to it, but moved closer so I could hear more. I tried to look unconcerned so as not to frighten the others. Some were already crying, and Thelma had a heart condition. Her face was turning blue. I heard a man's voice say, "They're children. What'll we do? Have them draw straws to see who gets the rope around their neck?" "It may be the only way. There must be 1,000 people out there, armed and coming this way." "Some of the patrolmen are throwing down their badges," another voice said. "We got to get them out of here." I heard footsteps coming closer, and I moved to the center of the room. A tall, raw-boned man came toward us. "I am Gene Smith, Assistant Chief of Little Rock Police Department," he spoke in a calm voice. "It's time for you to leave for today. Come with me." Right away I had a good feeling about him. He acted as if it mattered to him whether we got out. His was the voice I had heard from the next room, saying he would rather get all of us out than hang one to save the others. We moved at a quick pace and descended stairs into the passageways that became dimmer and dimmer. What if they were going to kill us? I didn't really know these men. We sped down into a dark cellar where one of the men ahead switched on a flashing light. We were inside some kind of basement garage. In the distance was a huge door that appeared to lift upward with chain pulleys. It resembled a loading dock of some kind. 2 cars were sitting with engines running, lights on, hoods pointing toward the door. "Hurry now, get in," Smith said. A white driver had a terrified expression on his face. His eyes were darting back and forth. "Roll your windows up, lock your doors, keep your faces away from the window. Put your heads down when we start to move." His voice quivered. He hunched over to secure something, and I saw a gun in the leather holster strapped to his side. "Listen to your driver's instructions," Smith said, "and do exactly what he says. Your lives depend on it." The enormous roaring sound of the crowd was just beyond the door. For one instant, I tried to imagine what would happen if the mob got a hold of us. "Now," Smith shouted, "let her roll." The driver shifted gears and gunned the engine as I crouched down in the back seat. Suddenly I heard the loud sound of what must have been heavy chain dragging. The door was opening. I scooted farther down in the seat, hiding my face. The car surged ahead. We were climbing upward out of the basement toward bright sunlight. I could hear the tires spin onto gravel. The car lunged forward, and the deafening noise of the mob engulfed us. "Get 'em! Hang 'em! Stop those cars!" I saw wave after wave of angry white faces everywhere. Their mouths were open, shouting threats. Clusters of white hands, with fingers extended, seemed to envelope us, clutching, grabbing at us. "Hold on and keep your heads down," the driver shouted. I heard the engine grind and felt us go faster. People running beside us were hurling rocks and sticks at us. That's when the car really began moving fast, faster than I'd ever ridden before. Finally, there were fewer hands and faces on the car window. Then the noises were subsiding. I took a deep breath. When President Dwight Eisenhower heard about the events in Little Rock on September 23rd, he called what had happened that day disgraceful. He vowed to use the full power of the United States, whatever force necessary, to see that integration was carried out. Eisenhower called in 1,200 paratroopers from the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, to escort Melba and the other black students to and from school and class, to guard the entrance, and to patrol the halls of Central High. September 25th. We pulled up in front of the Central High School. Hostile white people with scowls on their faces lined the sidewalk, shaking their fists. Soldiers stood at intervals several feet apart. A group of 20 or more ran breakneck speed up and down the street in front of Central High, their bayonets pointed straight ahead. Our driver, Sarge, said they were doing crowd control, keeping the mob away. I saw a group of uniformed men walking toward us, their bayonets pointed straight up, their leader beckoning to us as one of them held open the car door. As I stepped outside, I heard a noise in the distance, that chilling, familiar chant, 2, 4, 6, 8, we ain't gonna integrate. Reporters were swarming across the street from the school. Helicopters hovered in midair with blades whirling. About 20 Screaming Eagle soldiers moved toward us, forming an olive drab square with one end open. I glanced at the faces of my friends. Like me, they appeared to be impressed by the imposing sight of military power. We walked through the open end of the square, rifles at their sides, faces stern. The soldiers did not make eye contact as they surrounded us in a protective cocoon. After a long moment, the leader motioned us to move forward. Hundreds of astonished Central High School high students milled about. Some were peering out of the window, others were watching from the yard, some were tearful, others angry. I felt proud and sad at the same time, proud that I lived in a country that would go this far to bring justice to a Little Rock girl like me, but sad that people had to go to such great lengths. Yes, this is the United States, I thought to myself. There is a reason I salute the flag. We began moving forward. The eerie silence of the movement would forever be etched in my memory. All I could hear was my own heartbeat and the sound of boots clicking on the stone. Everyone seemed to be moving in slow motion as I peered past the raised bayonets of the 101st soldiers. I walked on the concrete path toward the front door, the same path the Arkansas National Guard had blocked us from days before. We approached the stairs, our feet moving in unison to the rhythm of the marching click-clack sound of the Screaming Eagles. Step by step we climbed upward, where none of my people have ever before walked as a student. We stepped up to the front door of the school and crossed the threshold into the place where angry segregationist mobs had forbidden us to go. The Screaming Eagles had delivered us safely inside the front door of Central High School. Conditions at Central High did not improve for a long time. Abusive teens found many opportunities to torment the 9 black students. Melba was stabbed, choked, and had burning chemicals thrown in her eyes. In May of 1958, Ernest Green, the only senior among the 9, risked death threats to graduate. The next September, Governor Fabus closed Little Rock schools completely, prompting a court case that lasted 2 years. Finally, in September of 1960, Central High School reopened and integration slowly continued.